Good afternoon, Grace Community Chapel family. Glad to be with you today and taking a look at Psalm chapter 14. We're getting in the afternoon. I know it's a little bit later than normal, and hopefully, for the most part, I'll be moving forward doing these in the morning, but there will be occasionally some that are going to slip through the gaps and end up in the later afternoon. So we're looking at Psalm chapter 14 today, and specifically taking a look at the passages of David. There's actually two psalms that are very similar. We'll look at probably both of those today. But we'll start with Psalm chapter 14 and kind of get into the text. So, starting off the bat, Psalm 14, to the choir master of David. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and they do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand it, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all of the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread? And do they not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion when the Lord restores the fortunes of his people. Let Jacob rejoice and let Israel be glad. That is Psalms chapter 14. So this starts off, and of course you'll notice that the ESV Bible uses the very first phrase as the title of the psalm. It starts off with, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, this is in reference to someone who is atheistic or maybe just agnostic. And we know from Romans chapter 1 that there are no true atheists, that everyone knows that God exists because what he has revealed is evident to them. And that's what Romans chapter 1 says. However, they live as though, and they act as though, and they may even try to convince themselves that there is no God. And so these are people who are describing themselves as atheistic, and even in our days, agnostic, just atheistic in terms of the Christian God. And something we have to say is they're not as evil as they can be. Because what is said next is they are corrupt, they do abominable deeds, and there is no one who does good, or none that does good. Here's the thing. Every human being bears the marks of their creator and being made in his image. And as common grace that has been given to all mankind is evident in their lives as well. However, David does make a reasonable point here in that the one who says there is no God, who would deliver a standard of right or wrong? Because let's think about it this way. If the atheist or the agnostic says there is no God, or that the Christian God is not the standard of morality, then what is the standard? How do we know that stealing is objectively wrong? How do we know that lying is wrong objectively? How do we know that murder is actually wrong objectively? Now, an atheist might say, well, they're wrong when you do it against me because I don't like it. But how do we have an objective standard of morality without God? And so this is part of what specifically I think David is getting at here in this text, is he's talking about the inevitable end of someone who rejects the existence of God, especially the God of the Christian scriptures. That would be the Jewish God at this point. See, the reason why those things that we object to and we say that those are morally wrong, they're wrong because God's not a robber. God doesn't lie, and he's not a murderer. That's the reason why those things are wrong. They're wrong because it's contrary to God's character. See, Christians, we get our morality from God. God that spoke the world into existence is a definer of what is right and wrong in the world that he created. He gets to set the rules, and those rules are bound up in who he is in both his nature and character. Due to that fact, the atheist and the agnostic have no moral ground for ethics. In fact, there's so much confusion in the world about what is right and wrong. And we're seeing that played out in our societies today. Every single aspect of our society, that's being played out. Because here's the element of which atheists have gone to at this point. Many of them now argue that the overall ethic of the world is to not cause harm, and that is the ultimate ethic. But the problem is, who defines what is harm? What might be seen as harm to one person may in fact be to their good. God himself actually declares this in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 11. He says, "My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be wearied when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for the discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there that your father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subjected to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short while," referring to our earthly fathers, "as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we might share in his holiness." Then verse 11, catch this. "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields a peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." The reality is harm cannot be the definition, because discipline oftentimes feels like harm to me. However, God, when he is disciplining us, he does it towards our good, even though it might feel like harm. And so these standards of harm as a morality is a no good standard. It's not objectable. You can't say this is going to work for all of societies in all places. But what does work is the standard of who God is and who he's declared himself to be, and what he has said should be the rules for the world that he's created. So this is something that we must understand from the scriptures. There are none that do good. That's what he says kind of in the conclusion of that passage. There is none that do good. This is consistent throughout all of the scriptures. This means that no one does what is righteous and upright before the eyes of the Lord. That doesn't mean that people don't perform the occasional good actions, because they do. But the reality is that we're created to love God and enjoy him forever. That's specifically what the Westminster Confession uses as their opening line of the purpose and reason for man's existence. Anything shy of that bar is just not good enough. And we see that being alluded to specifically in verse 2, when it says, "The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there's any who understand, any who seek after God." That's the doing good. So God looks down on us and he sees if anyone on their own seeks after God, if anyone understands on his own what God is looking for. In fact, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 makes this very point when he's talking about those of faith. He says, verse 6, "Without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." That is ultimately the core of what God is seeking for people, is that they would know that he exists, which he has revealed abundantly through his creation and through the conscience that he's given man, and two, that he's a rewarder of those who pursue him. So we see ultimately in verse 3, there's a sad state that everyone has turned aside. They've gone after something else. They've looked after anything else other than the Creator God. And this has resulted in their corruption. And even if we ourselves did not stand condemned in the sin of Adam, we ourselves are corrupt and we follow after our own sinful desires. That means that ultimately that, again, there is none who do good. And there's not even one that does good. And this is specifically repeated in Psalm 53. Psalm 53 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." We saw it's very similar. "They are corrupt, doing abominable iniquity, for there is none who does good." Might sound familiar, right? "God looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there's any who understand, any who seek after God." Sounds familiar, right? "They have all fallen away. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one." See how similar it is? It's almost the exact same thing. And then he kind of continues and he says, "Have those who work evil no knowledge, who eat at my people as they eat bread and do not call on God? They are there in great terror where there is no terror. For God scatters the bones of him who encamps against you. You put him to shame. God has rejected them. Oh, that salvation of Israel will come out of Zion, for the Lord restores the fortunes of his people. Let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad." Now you might think, wait, you're reading Psalm 10 again. No, I'm not. It's actually a different psalm saying almost the exact same thing. And this is exactly what Paul uses when he's ultimately writing to the Romans. He garbles a ton of Old Testament texts into one kind of paragraph. And two of the main texts that he uses are specifically Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. And that's where he comes in and he says right here, "For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As it is written, no one is righteous, no, not one. Now, no one understands, no one seeks after God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave, quoting from somewhere else. They use their tongues to deceive, from somewhere else. The venom of asps is under their lips, somewhere else. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness, somewhere else. Their feet are swift to shed blood, somewhere else. And their paths are ruin and misery. And then somewhere else, the way of peace they have not known. And the last thing is from another text, he says, and there is no fear of God before their eyes. He continues to say, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. The reality here is that if we go by the good standards that we hold ourselves up to in doing good, there is no way that we're going to be justified. No human being will be justified by doing good things of the law. Even if you try to follow the law perfectly, you're not going to, and you're not going to be justified in that manner. Because ultimately, the law only comes the knowledge of sin. You know what's wrong, and then you're incapable of really doing what's right. And the more that the law is given to you, the more that you understand what's right and what God demands of you, the more you realize, I can't measure up, I can't do this. And sometimes we get to the place, especially the agnostics and the atheists, are like, that's not fair of God to demand that. But the point is that it is fair. God created us. He gets to decide the standard. Now, that's why he's provided salvation through his Son from Zion. We'll get there in a second. So going back to Psalm chapter 14, and he says, verse 4, we see kind of specifically David here is describing their works. And he says, have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? Have they no knowledge? Are they not aware? And then he says in verse 5, they're in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. Now that might be a little confusing if we didn't already read Psalm 53, where it says, have those who work evil no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord. Rather than calling upon the Lord for seeking repentance, they continue in their evil ways. In fact, pursue the righteous people and eat them up. They try to destroy them like bread. But then he says in verse 5, they're in great terror where there is no terror. God scatters the bones of him who camps against you. There's the idea that God is going to uphold the righteous person before him, which is exactly what we see in verse 6. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. David, in writing to the person who's doing evil against the poor, who said there's no God, there's no way I'm going to be judged by what I do. I'm just living for this life now. He said, you would shame the plans of the poor. You would cause problems for the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. And he reminds those who come against the poor and those who that they are the ones who cling to the Lord for refuge. And that although these God-denying people who seek to do evil and destroy the poor, that the Lord is their refuge and is unmovable and ultimately will come against them, destroy them, and scatter their bones. Verse 7. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion when the Lord restores the fortunes of his people. Let Jacob rejoice and let Israel be glad. The same exact comments that we see in Psalm 53. And this concludes with an allusion of David saying, I know there's a salvation coming for Israel. Now, what's interesting is this isn't during a time period of a divided kingdom. This isn't during the exile. This isn't during those times when Israel is away from Zion. They're looking still for a redeemer, one who is to make all things new, to make things right. As Jeremiah says, to take out the heart of stone and to put in a heart of flesh that they might be able to obey the commandments and that his spirit might dwell with man. That is what they're looking to, that salvation for Israel. That restoration. And many of you, including myself as Gentiles, were grafted into that promise due to the rejection of Israel of Christ. Praise be to God that the deliverer has come so that we might be delivered from our condition, made new by the mercy and grace that comes through the death of Jesus at the cross. That is the good news about how bad things are and how no one does good and no one is righteous, but there was one, Jesus Christ the righteous, who was God in human form, who took on the penalty of sin on my behalf, on your behalf, so that we might cling to him for salvation, and that we might be called good and we might be called righteous, not because of our own righteousness, but because of the righteousness of him, and that we might cling to his righteousness as he advocates for us before the Father. That is the exciting news of the gospel. So, A little bit in Psalm chapter 14 today. Hopefully, you picked up some stuff today. I certainly did. And looking forward to doing Psalm 15 tomorrow with you. God bless you all. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you again real soon.